So Marvel Comics has had some incredibly powerful beings over the years, some of which don't exist anymore and some of which do. You got Mad Jim Jaspers, Mr. M, the Marquis of Death, Clyde Wincham, the White Phoenix of the Crown, Jean Grey, Franklin Richards. But no character in Marvel Comics has ever been as powerful as Protege. We did a Beyond Omega level video on him once upon a time, but we never covered the story on how he became so powerful and basically rivaled the one above all. So the idea behind Protege and his origin essentially starts off in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, issue number 16. And what we're told in this particular point is that many thousands of years ago, in this alternate reality, Earth 691 is where it takes place, a strange religious sect arose on this planet. They worshipped a deity they called the Magus, and in his name, they conquered this, their homeworld. Now, most people know the Magus as being the evil future version of Adam Warlock, but with the Earth 691 universe, what we're going to find is things are very different from what we're used to with regards to how characters are depicted outside of the Living Tribunal. And so what it says is, before too many centuries had passed, they led their faithful on a holy crusade to try and find their God, and in the course of their travels to bear witness to his divinity to any they might encounter. If a planet refused to convert to the Universal Church of Truth, it was summarily destroyed. But no matter how many planets they conquered, no deity was forthcoming, and so over 1,000 generations, they set about to create their God in their own image. Through selective breeding, genetic manipulation, and various chemicals, drugs, sciences, and arcane magics culled from the worlds that they had conquered, they attempted to create him. He who would become the Magus, the most powerful being ever conceived of mortal woman. And 7 short years ago, their labor finally bore fruit when the child they call the Protege was born. The child who is worshipped as a god in over half of the galaxy, and a god he may well be. For so powerful is this child that a tutor is necessary to teach him how to correctly channel his all might. Now here's the thing that makes Protege so astronomically powerful. Protege had the ability to copy the power of any power he saw, and there was no upper limit to it. Now here's where things get really, really interesting, but before we talk about that, let's talk about Malevolence for a second. The long and short of Malevolence is she's the daughter of Mephisto in this 31st century in Earth 691. And Mephisto, of course, as you guys know, being a really evil guy, is always up to various schemes. So the whole intention of Malevolence is to basically become the matriarch, the caretaker for Protege, so she can subtly manipulate him and then ultimately turn him into somebody who can be used by Mephisto because of his incredible power. But getting to the really interesting part here, the whole idea of Protege basically going to war against the Living Tribunal is all because of 2 people. The first one is a guy named Vance Astro, also known as Major Victory. The second is the Beyonder. I told you guys things get nuts in this story. It's so cool, right? Things get nuts in this story. So here's how things play out with Major Victory, right? With Vance Astro, because it's important to understand this. So a lot of you guys may be aware that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 was in the future, but if it's in the future, why is it called Earth 691? So in Marvel 2-in-1, issue number 69, the original Guardians of the Galaxy traveled to the past to basically engage in some stuff. And I believe it was the Korvac saga, but I'm not going to swear to that. What matters is this. Vance Astro had lived a pretty rough life in the sense that he had signed up to be an astronaut at 16 years old. His body was basically encased in a kind of suit that kept him young. His organs were modified so they would never age. And then he was shot out into space. The idea being that in 1,000 years, he would wake up and he would be able to help humanity colonize whatever was out there. Well, in 1,000 years, he did wake up, but humanity beat him to the punch. And so in effect, he wasted 1,000 years of his life. And so Vance Astro from the Guardians of the Galaxy, when they had traveled back into the past, had basically tried to convince his younger self not to become an astronaut and effectively change his own fate. This matters because that's how Earth 691 became an alternate reality. Now, on top of that, things started unfolding in very interesting interesting ways, because in the Earth 691 universe, for example, Secret Wars never happened. The original Secret Wars story, the origin of the Molecule Man and everything is the same, but the Beyonder never looked into that universe. He never had a reason to, right? There was nothing that drew his attention. All this changed when you came across this wonky-ass guy by the name of Bubonicus. I know, it sounds nonsensical. It's literally this almost celestial type being that infects people with a deadly virus, hence the on-the-nose name that he has. What Bubonicus had done is, believing that all life is irrelevant, believing that all life needs to end, the ultimate nihilist, he had quite literally infected eternity. And when that happened, that drew the attention of the Beyonder. And that's why, while Bubonicus is ultimately defeated in some capacity, Major Victory is visited by the Beyonder, because the Beyonder is showing up here for the very first time. And here's one of the coolest elements to this. When the Beyonder talks to Major Victory doesn't know who he is. He's never heard of the Beyonder. And so the Beyonder just simply says, I am from beyond. And he says, I come from another universe where I reign supreme. Until now, I was unaware of this alternate plane of existence. Recent events of cosmic proportions allowed a window to open, and I became intrigued. Bubonicus, the Plaguebringer, initiated the breach. It was subsequently sealed by the Phoenix of your universe, but my curiosity was piqued. Now, here's an important distinction to understand here. This moment with the Beyonder comes after Fantastic Four issue number 319. Why does that matter? Because Fantastic Four 319 was Secret Wars 3, right? Secret Wars 1, 1984, Secret Wars 2 in 1985. Secret Wars 3 was also supposed to be a 12-issue story that basically wrapped up the story of the Beyonder and the Molecule Man. Marvel didn't go through with it, but that is the story that's also known as the Beyonder retcon. You guys have heard of pre-retcon Beyonder, post-retcon Beyonder? That was the story that did it. And so the version of the Beyonder that you see here is nowhere near as powerful as he was in the original Secret Wars from 84 and Secret Wars 2 from 85. And when he makes reference to basically being an entire universe, that's what happened in Secret Wars 3, that he effectively became his own reality. And so that's why he tells Major Victory, I observed many more beings in your universe outside of you. Firelord, the Spirit of Vengeance, Dormammu, Starhawk, all fascinating creatures, yet I found two others even more so. Behold, and he holds up this crystal, and in this crystal he reveals he captured both Protege and Malevolence. Now here's a crazy thing about this, right? If Protege has the ability to copy the powers of anybody he sees, then how in the world did the Beyonder capture him? Well, that's addressed immediately, because Malevolence asked him, right, you can duplicate any power that you observe, release us from this prison right now. And the response of Protege, I can't, right? That man trapped us by merely thinking it. I cannot mimic an unseen thought, at least not yet anyway. And so literally they were just captured, and the Beyonder just kind of finds them intriguing. And so Malevolence calls out to her father for some kind of aid. And so where Beyonder has a few more words to Major Victory, they really fall more in line with the story, which is to simply just kind of basically help him come to terms with his own history. Major Victory, because of the 1,000 years spent frozen in space, was designed to kind of be a 31st century allegory for Captain America, right? A man out of time, that sort of thing, having lost everything he cared about. The idea is that he has a lot more power than he thinks, right? And then the Beyonder just effectively takes off. And so all that really happens with Protege and Malevolence is that for a while in the comics, they're just kind of stuck in this crystal, and he's always trying to blast his way out, but he can never quite escape until someone shows up here. Specifically, when the Beyonder is musing to himself, right? Just looking at Protege, looking at Malevolence, looking at their useless efforts to try to find some kind of escape, he says, bicker on, my little pets. You are truly an amazing pair. Perhaps I should sample more unusual specimens from this universe. But this being who appears out of nowhere simply says, those days are over, Beyonder. And where Beyonder's kind of surprised, this guy simply says, I am the tracker. I have been commissioned to locate and retrieve these two kidnapped beings. And he says, you covered your cross-multiversal trail well, Beyonder, but not well enough to elude me. And he shatters the crystal. Now, in that moment, Protege is free, and the tracker ends up goading the Beyonder. Now, here's the thing to know. The Beyonder was warned about the powers of Protege by Major Victory. He can copy abilities, do not use use your powers when you are around him. But the Beyonder, ever an arrogant and hubris person, ignores the warning, and he says, behold the Beyonder, this is my reality, one in which I decree that you shall die horribly, and then tries to use his powers on malevolence. And when that happens, Protege immediately fires back and says, the tracker made you lose control and display your power, Beyonder. By doing so, I can duplicate it, and I shall. And so at that point, it's now a stalemate. He is equal to the Beyonder. Just like that, there's no grand buildup or anything along those lines. The Beyonder used a power, Protege can copy it. But here's the caveat to this. Protege can only use powers that he sees somebody else use. And the Beyonder is not using all his powers. But Protege, continually getting cocky, says there is no level that you can achieve that I cannot match. Such is the power of Protege. And the response to the Beyonder, then let us see if you can keep up with me, insolent pup, and just starts attacking him. And so while all that's going on, the fight between the two, the Living Tribunal appears to Eternity and says, Eternity, I told you the boy was your responsibility. Specifically in issue number 16, the idea was that the Living Tribunal appeared to Eternity and said, now that this is unfolded in your universe, you need to figure out a way to contain it, because the power of Protege is such that he could usurp even you. So if you fail to do your job, I will step in and do it for you. And that's why Eternity says acknowledged. However, there are forces at work that I could not anticipate. Perhaps we need to contact them. And the Living Tribunal's response, that is a distinct possibility. How heals your injury? And of course, Eternity says, it's healing slowly. Now them, the individuals they're referring to, we'll find out who they're talking about, because that's where things get a little wonky depending on how you perceive everything going on the cosmic side of Marvel. But the Living Tribunal turns his direct attention to everything going on between Protege and the Beyonder, because from his perspective, this is going to completely change the course of everything. Whoever comes out on top here will forever change the course of this universe and even beyond the universe. And that's why the Beyonder just kind of thinks to himself as opposed to speaking out loud, planning strategy, right? He says, I have made one grievous error by bringing this child to my universe. I will not make another by allowing him to usurp my place as its sole ruler. And so he says, hear me, stripling, this standstill battle may be over, but the war will resume on my terms. And he teleports away. And initially Protege kind of gets carried away with himself, right? He's like, I won, right? Like I made the guy finally leave, right? I made him get out of here. See how powerful I am? Because at the end of the day, he's a young kid with virtually unrivaled abilities. And that's where Mephisto presents himself, because the tracker was really Mephisto in disguise. Now, where Malevolence is a relatively interesting character, albeit only about 18 appearances, and these are the only ones that you really see, that Mephisto is far older and far more experienced with being duplicitous. And so that's why when Malevolence is just kind of like, perhaps, maybe you beat Beyonder, we don't really know. And Protege gets really frustrated by it. The fact that he's not getting a pat on the back, he's not receiving the kind of approval he feels like he deserves. Mephisto chimes in and says, we both observed your glorious triumph over the hostile captor from beyond. Forgive her, Protege. She was struck dumb by your magnificence, as was I. And where Protege doesn't really know who Mephisto is, outside of the fact that he realizes Mephisto disguised himself as the tracker, Mephisto's like, yes, I can take on many disguises. For example, I can take on the form of Replica, your former playmate. And he says, but I'm sure that, the all-powerful Protege has more important things to do than observe my parlor tricks. But that's where he's kind of getting under the nature of Protege, basically cold reading him, figuring out what he likes and what he doesn't like. And the response of Protege, no, that was awesome. I miss my friends, right? Can you make more of them? Can you become my old advisor, Jiltrin? And that's where Mephisto's like, of course I can, right? Of course I can become your old advisor. And as your old advisor, you and I will become fantastic friends. And here is what I would advise you to do, because it's the mind of a child, right? Easily manipulated. And so that's where you switch back to the Living Tribunal and Eternity. It's a relatively short bit of a conversation here, but Eternity says, I sense your final decision has been reached, Tribunal. And the response of the Tribunal? Affirmative, right? The Protege's threat to the multiverse outweighs all else. We may proceed once he arrives. Now, I will say there is also a cosmic entity in this named Hawk God. The reality here is that going through his whole history would really throw the video off track. So we'll simply just say he's a cosmic entity that nobody else really takes seriously. But where he starts talking about being dismissed, not being taken seriously by eternity and the living tribunal, the tribunal stops the argument between eternity and the Hawk God and simply says, silence, right? The approver's arrival is imminent, but his attention and mine shall focus solely on the boy. And so that's when you switch back to Protege, because basically becoming a friend to Mephisto, what neither of them knows is that the Beyonder is watching them have their conversation. Because again, Protege can only copy powers that he knows about. He cannot duplicate powers that he doesn't know about. And the Beyonder didn't reveal his full hand. In terms of just raw brute strength, sure, right? Like Protege 100% can match the Beyonder. But in terms of the Beyonder's cunning and the fact that he is so incredibly talented when it comes to strategy, Protege can't necessarily keep up with that. And so at that moment, the Beyonder does the only thing he can think to do, right? He summons the Guardians of the Galaxy directly to him. Now, in the face of beings like Mephisto and his daughter Malevolence, and especially Protege, there's not a whole lot that the Guardians are going to be able to do. But the thought process of the Beyonder here is this, right? When the Guardians show up, he says, I am the Beyonder. I needed you, Guardians of the Galaxy, to help repel those who would usurp my universe. Major Victory warned me to beware the boy, and in my haughtiness, I ignored you. Even a god can admit error and learn humility, just as the Protege is about to learn a much needed lesson in respect, because the idea is that with their powers combined, they can overcome Protege. But Protege, again, copying pretty much all the abilities of the Beyonder, or at least all the abilities that matter, goes to fight him yet again. But the Beyonder says, you have begun to assimilate the full extent of true cosmic power, child. And the response of Protege, then show me what you've got, right? And I'll match it, every single bit of power that you have. But before they can really square off in a meaningful way, they're teleported away. And they're literally brought directly to the tribunal. And where they don't really know what's going on here, the response of the tribunal, your disgraceful behavior has brought you before the living tribunal. Judgment is upon you both. To that end, he shall bear witness. So be it. And where Protege is very dismissive, the response of the Beyonder is, show some semblance and decorum, youngster. We stand before a celestial. Now, here's the crazy thing about this, specifically Skathan the Approver. It's one of these elements of Marvel Comics that's incredibly inconsistent. The Celestials have never been on par with a being like Eternity and especially the Living Tribunal. Even throughout their entire history, they have been incredibly powerful, and there have been points where it's been argued that they were the creators of all existence. More recently, Al Ewing established they created the Beyonders themselves, but we're kind of leaving that bit of an adjustment out. The reality here is that Celestials are universal entities, right? They operate on a universal level. And so having this Celestial here, a lot of people misunderstand the role of Skathan the Approver. His role here is not to be a being that is more powerful than the Living Tribunal or Eternity. He is here to basically operate as some measure of a judge. Now, Marvel never really explains why, they don't really give us any meaningful reasons, and just kind of ask us to roll with it, but it is kind of cool the way that it plays out. Because what goes on here is that the Living Tribunal simply says, Eternity, introduce the accused. And Eternity says, Beyonder and Protege, you stand in the presence of a celestial, the Living Tribunal, myself, and the Hawk God. Prepare to have your sentence passed and witnessed. And the response of the Beyonder, right, child, cosmic politics makes strange bedfellows. Let us set aside our quarrel. Use your unique ability to mimic power displays and follow my lead. And so what happens is the two of them attack Eternity. And because of the fact that Eternity would, in some capacity, defend itself, they're basically able to use their abilities to destroy Eternity. Because the Beyonder says Eternity pauses, and in doing so, is destroyed. And Protege compliments his statement, and he says, let it all out, Beyonder. I'm a nanosecond behind you. But then, in an instant, everything goes back to normal. And literally, they're just like, everything reverted back as if nothing happened. And the response of eternity is very telling here, right? He says, "For indeed, nothing has. Heed me, godlings. My appearance is dictated by your own limited comprehension." And he says, "I am the sum total of all that exists along the temporal axis, yet I am far from alone in the infinite multiverse. Other sentient life forms have imagined me as sound waves, images of avatars, or weather patterns. Some merely go mad. It matters not, for perception is reality. In truth, eternity is an abstract entity with no physical attributes. What you think you see is merely a manifestation of your concept of my very existence. Do you presume to do battle with your own thoughts? Accept your fate with dignity befitting the privileges you've been granted in this lifetime, and be silent." Now, here's a crazy thing about this, right? That what's really being purported here is that because eternity is an abstract, no physical form, the physical form he gets is from Anthropomorpho, the Dimension of Manifestations, right? All that covered in the old Quasar comics from Ron Mars and Greg Capullo, that eternity cannot really be destroyed. But that's not true. Right, we know that from just various comics, and you would have to assume that in the main Marvel Universe, in some ways, it scales to virtually every reality. That if eternity and infinity represent the very fabric of the universe itself, time and space, that to destroy the universe is to destroy them. But to simply destroy them without destroying the universe, that's a lot more interesting, because now you're trying to destroy an ideology. And that's what eternity is saying. So long as there is any single being out there in the universe that believes in the idea of some physical manifestation, or even recognizes that the universe occupies a space and the universe will go on for a set period of time, eternity and infinity cannot truly be killed. You would have to wipe out the whole universe in order to do it. Now again, that's within the confines of this story. Other stories deal with it in certain ways, but the response of Protege here, liar, right? You're all afraid of me and what I can do. As my power escalates, it invariably frightens the next level of the hierarchy. Acknowledge my superiority and I may spare you, but make no mistake, I am the most powerful being there ever was. I will surpass you all and I will move up. And of course, the Living Tribunal says impossible, right? There is only one above the Living Tribunal. Your journey ends here, child. And that's where the Beyonder chimes in, right? He's like, what of the Beyonder, right? I demand satisfaction. What part does the silent celestial play in this bizarre drama? And that's where the Tribunal says, Skathan the Approver comes only to observe and record my judgment upon you both for daring to threaten the fundamental balance of the multiverse. And that's the true role of Skathan the Approver here, for reasons that are just never really explained but confined to the story. The Living Tribunal cannot act in this universe unless Skathan the Approver approves of it. Now, that's simply just the rules, right? I mean, we're not really told why those rules are the rules. We're simply just told that they are. And so while all that's going on, Eternity is actually shocked to see that both Starhawks, right, both members of the Guardians of the Galaxy, actually leave his physical form and show up in this place that's basically the Far Shore. Now, full transparency here, their story's not overly important to everything that's going on. All that's really going to happen is that because of how things transpire, that the idea of there being two Starhawks is going to go away, and that Marvel is basically going to reduce things down to one Starhawk. That's the only reason why they're here. What does matter here is that the Beyonder, in seeing all of this, tells Protege that we should use this time to prepare a strategy, right? The time where Hawk God and Living Tribunal and Eternity and Skathan the Approver are focusing on the Starhawks. But the response of Protege, silence Beyonder. I am concentrating on duplicating the power displays that I have observed thus far. Already I have achieved levels of infinite awareness that a puny godling like you could never conceive of. And so while that's going on, Skathan the Approver suddenly teleports the Guardians of the Galaxy directly to this location. The reason being because the Guardians are in possession of the amulet of the Ancient One, which may be needed in this conflict. And it's also a reason to have the star of the comics in this whole thing that's going down. And so while the whole situation kind of continues to unfold with the Starhawks and the cosmic entities are all distracted, that after a moment or two, the Beyonder finally points something out when the Guardians of the Galaxy start asking, like, what in the world is going on? Why are they here, right? What does any any of this have to do with them, right? The Starhawks, Protege, and that's where the Beyonder stops them and says, you have mentioned the only one of any consequence, Jovian, for on the boy rests the fate of any and all realities. Behold, and all these cosmic entities who are here observe what's happening. The living tribunal, eternity, Skaithen the Approver, Hawk God, and all of them are experiencing these different variations of shock, right? We're told the cosmic entities turn and observe that which the Beyonder has indicated. Their individual reactions vary from logical confirmation to supreme shock, and from silent observation to sudden cold fear. Because in that moment, Protege appears as the living tribunal, literally taking his form. And he says, on your knees, insects, for I am now the one above all. I reside above the tribunal despite having your form. Supplicate yourselves before the mighty Protege. He literally becomes that powerful. He becomes the one above all. He's that astronomically capable. Now, the statement of him being the one above all is probably more hubris than anything else, hence the reason why he has the 3 heads of the living tribunal. But the fact is, right, simply being able to duplicate that level of power is insane, because he says, the one above all has spoken. This realm of cosmic beings and the multiverse it encompasses now belong to me. And when the tribunal fires back and says, in this blasphemous display at once, lest you lose what little remains of your immortal soul child, no one really knows what to do here. And in fact, no one really can do anything here. They're just kind of watching all this madness unfold, because these are levels of power that they can hardly even begin to understand. Because in the face of all of this, it descends into madness, right? Because of the fact that the Guardians of the Galaxy are here, the Starhawks are here, that Protege summons guys of his own, right? He literally summons Mephisto and Malevolence. But because of the fact that they're acting like 2 lower level gods would act, right? Trying to find some incredible level of power or squabbling over petty things, that in turn, he just gets frustrated with them, right? And it's like, you know what? I've had enough of you guys, and just like teleports them all away. At least just Mephisto and Malevolence, because they end up getting into a fight with the Guardians of the Galaxy. And so with Mephisto being so powerful, he's like, this is nonsense. I don't have time for any of this goofy stuff that's going on. And so where they're whisked away, Protege simply just addresses everyone here, all the cosmic entities, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and he says, it is finished. All that ever was or might ever be is now mine for the taking. I am tired of all of you. There shall be a new order designed by the Protege. Prepare yourselves for eternal oblivion. And in that moment, Skaithen the Approver judges against him, and that gives permission for the living tribunal to make his move. And so the first thing to deal with here is Beyonder, right? Because eternity says, adjudication is at hand, Beyonder. You bear the responsibility for creating this situation with your cross-multiversal tampering to appease your personal boredom. Yet by doing so, you ultimately forced us to bring this matter to a final conclusion. And so Beyonder is told, you are deemed worthy to retain your omnipotent position within your own universe, but no further. Your reality shall henceforth be sealed against all external contact. Let it be so. So in essence, the universe of the Beyonder is cut off from every other universe in the multiverse. And so back in his own universe, he kind of takes a combination of his past experiences and almost kind of his lust for power that he's regained, and kind of talks about creating life of his own and all that kind of stuff. But in effect, he's locked away from everything. In turn, the tribunal turns his attention to Protege. Now, up until that moment, the instant that Skaithen the Approver had ruled against Protege, that basically a sort of orb was put over his head and his hands, so he couldn't see anything that was unfolding, which is important considering the fact that Living Tribunal was using his power to cut the Beyonder off from this reality, and so on and so forth. And so the tribunal says the verdict is unanimous. Equity, vengeance, and necessity all agree. The 3 faces of the tribunal are in unison. Your actions and intentions are inexcusable. Skaithen, remove the celestial muzzle. Make your peace. May the one above all forgive you. And where Protege just starts lashing out, talking about the idea that all power was meant to be his, that he's supposed to be the one above all, the response of the tribunal: power is meaningless beyond this level of existence. Selfish desire feeds upon itself and is consumed, child, just as you shall be now. Because an hourglass emerges from the living tribunal, right? The eternal hourglass. In essence, it's a holding cell, and that Protege is absorbed into it and then absorbed into the living tribunal, locked away, never to be seen or heard from again. And at that moment, the tribunal whisks everybody away and everything gets set back to rights. It's nuts, right? I mean, Protege kind of loses in a pretty, anticlimactic way, but it is dope to see just how powerful he became. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end, kind of a chunky one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.